Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Age Kirikoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're talking about all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. I'll talk about which defenses last season were giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers on a weekly basis in a half PPR scoring format on average. Again, giving you guys my perspective and opinions as to which players potentially have the most advantageous or disadvantageous matchups on the week. Of course, after that, we'll talk about how the wide receiver position stacks up in my mind, as I'll talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings. Before we get into that, I of course want to thank you guys for the incredible support, continuing to show up with your viewership, commenting down below, smashing that like button. I cannot thank you guys enough. For those of you who have not yet already, make sure you subscribe to the channel. I can't emphasize enough how important it is going to be for your 2021 fantasy football season. Again, we're making content every single day, whether it is running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback rankings, Sunday morning live streams, waiver wire episodes, and various other content on Fridays and Saturdays that is going to rotate and definitely set you up for success. Of course, if you're trying to capture a 2021 fantasy football championship, this is the place to do it. Outside of that, for those of you who continue to purchase my 2021 fantasy football draft guide, thank you very much. And of course, for those of you who have just recently joined the Patreon, your guys' support has been incredible. We just recently surpassed 300 supporters there, getting to our goal and continuing on. Thank you guys a lot. I mean, that is just insane. I can't thank you guys enough. All right, let's get into it, shall we? We've covered it. Again, like I've mentioned before, timestamps are down in the description of the video for those of you who are looking there. If you're looking to support on Patreon and get other statistics and or flex rankings that are only for Patreon users and all the other benefits, you can also find that down in the description. Today's rankings will be for a half PPR scoring format, and rankings will be subject to change. Again, we're only doing this at the beginning of the week. There is a lot of injuries and different news information that are going to come out as the week progresses. We're always keeping an eye on the players that are currently hit with the questionable tag, guys that are potentially going to miss or are going to potentially miss multiple practices prior to the game. We don't want to end up playing a guy that may be dealing with a hamstring injury, might re-aggravate it, and end up missing majority of the game, and of course could potentially end up losing your week. So keeping an eye on that. That is why rankings are always subject to change. There's always something different. Even defenders, maybe a cornerback that's a stud is going to play this week, makes the wide receiver value that much greater. Obviously, we'll keep an eye on that. So let's get into the beginning of today's wide receiver episode by talking about matchups. I did refer to it a little bit earlier. We want to go ahead and present to you guys the 2020 wide receiver strength of schedule. Which defenses were giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers on a weekly basis, on average, in a half PPR scoring format between weeks 1 through 17 of last season. Of course, the Atlanta Falcons were ranked number 1, which means they were giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers on a weekly basis. In fact, 37.61 was the average points given per week in comparison to the Los Angeles Rams, which again, their defense have shown up in multiple categories already in terms of not giving up a lot of points to opposing offensive threats, specifically running backs yesterday and now wide receivers once again. Now, the reason I, of course, wanted to show these statistics is to give you some perspective as to which defenses last year were really were not good. Could not stop anybody in terms of their secondary coverage, being able to stop wide receivers. Of course, Atlanta, the Tennessee Titans, the Lions, Cowboys, these were teams that we were going after every single week. We wanted to start our wide receivers against them. And as it currently stands, a lot of these secondaries haven't improved that drastically. So, of course, we'll be trying to expose them. I'll refer back to these statistics during today's episode as I talk about my top 36 wide receivers. But I, of course, wanted to show this to begin with. And let's get into it now, shall we? Let's begin by talking about my top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 1 of the 2021 fantasy football season, beginning with Davante Adams. Again, Davante Adams is one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League. He's finally getting more and more respect as the years progress, but he has been consistent for 4+ years straight. I mean, the guy has had 10+ touchdowns at 4 out of the last 5 seasons. He's continued to be Aaron Rodgers' number 1 wide receiver, despite the fact that there's literally no other receiving options in this offense. He's been getting double teamed year over year, but it doesn't matter. He is such an elegant route runner and one of the best offensive threats in the league. In the last 23 games of his career, including the NFL playoffs, he has had 10+ targets 19 times. Of course, Aaron Rodgers is funnel targeting this gentleman, and of course that is leading the fantasy points. There's a reason why last year, despite only playing 14 games, he averaged 22.75 fantasy points per game. This upcoming week, he takes on the New Orleans Saints, and though the Green Bay Packers did play the New Orleans Saints last year, Davante Adams was injured for one of those games. Again, like I mentioned, he only played 14 games last year, And Marshawn Lattimore is most likely going to be the corner coverage that he's going to see. Outside of the 2 instances every single year where Marshawn Lattimore is locking down Mike Evans, there are very few instances where Marshawn Lattimore is one of the best corners in the National Football League and locking down guys at the level of a Davante Adams. So as it currently stands, I expect Davante Adams to continue his trend of not only scoring touchdowns, getting double-digit targets, and of course scoring what? 19, 20, 21 plus fantasy points per game like he has done over the course of his career as of late. He's an absolute stud and my number 1 on the week. We move on to Tyreek Hill as our number 2. So, Tyreek Hill, similar to a Davante Adams. In terms of the last 3 seasons, he has scored 37 touchdowns. That's only barely ahead of Davante Adams, who's in second place with 36 receiving touchdowns. So Tyreek Hill, of course, has led the position with that specific category. Last season, had 17 total touchdowns throughout the 15 games that he played, and he averaged 19.03 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. This upcoming week, they take on the Cleveland Browns, and though the Cleveland Browns secondary was putrid last year, in fact, gave up the 8th most points to opposing wide receivers, they've significantly overhauled their defense. Just across the board, whether it is down in the trenches into the second level, and of course their secondary, they get Grant Delpit back. They brought in John Johnson, formerly of the Los Angeles Rams, another good secondary member who's going to play safety for them. Of course, they spent a first-round pick on Greg Newsome, the cornerback. They're going to continue to improve their secondary. But regardless of that, you have to play against Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, Patrick Mahomes in a very deadly Kansas City Chiefs offense that is retooled to start off their season on fire. And I expect them to do so, and that's definitely going to be the case for Tyreek Hill. The most recent time that Tyreek Hill took on the Cleveland Browns were in the NFL playoffs in 2020. And in that game, he had 10 targets that led to 8 receptions and 110 receiving yards. Unfortunately, was not able to get himself a receiving touchdown, but that's the level in which he is going to be able to produce, and I expect him to continue that level of play. Of course, having the threat of one play turning into 70 yards and a touchdown, on top of the fact that this guy is continuing to get more and more targets, exposure to opportunity, that is leading to his success. Tyreek Hill's a stud, and he's my number 2. Our number 3 wide receiver for today is Calvin Ridley, and I can't express to you guys how much I love Calvin Ridley this upcoming season. The amount of exposure to opportunity he's going to have in the absence of Julio Jones is going to be ridiculous. From 2019 to 2020, in the 8 games in which Calvin Ridley had no Julio Jones on the other side of the field from him, and Julio Jones was injured, Calvin Ridley averaged 16.25 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Of course, he's found a lot of success in the absence of Julio not being in that lineup, and I don't think he's going to require him to be there. Again, a lot of people have talked about this offseason. Can Calvin Ridley take on the double coverages and take on number 1 cornerbacks in the absence of Julio Jones because of how much pressure Julio pulls on the other side of the field? I think that he's poised and ready for another fantastic season here. Of course, plays against the Philadelphia Eagles this upcoming week. Darius Slay is most likely going to be the cornerback coverage this upcoming week. And to be honest, Darius Slay hasn't been good since he was with the Detroit Lions. In the last couple years with the Philadelphia Eagles, he has not been as good as a coverage corner and really is going to be put to the test with Calvin Ridley. The last time Calvin Ridley took on this defense, he absolutely torched them, going for 8 receptions on 10 targets for 105 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. That's 20 plus fantasy points in 2019 against this defense. I think he'll very easily be able to do something similar to that this upcoming week, as their secondary is going to be in shambles. We move on to Stefon Diggs as our number 4. Now, I really had the thought process of potentially moving Stefon Diggs to the number 3, considering how successful he has been coming off of his 2020 campaign. I mean, he led all wide receivers in total targets and receptions, and of course, averaged 16.57 fantasy points per game in 2020. Of course, there was an explosion of Josh Allen, the Bills offense, and of course, Stefon Diggs producing his greatest career season thus far. Now, the question is, what are we going to anticipate from him this upcoming week against the Pittsburgh Steelers? In my opinion, just looking back at last season, at the back end of the 2020 season, the Buffalo Bills did play against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and in that contest, Stefon Diggs absolutely torched that secondary on 14 total targets. Yeah, that's right, 14. Had 10 receptions, 130 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 24.6 points. I mean, if it worked then and it's not broke, don't fix it. Of course, obviously the defense, they're going to send Joe Hayden after him. They're going to try to double cover him. Stefon Diggs is a different type of receiver. He's built differently, and he's absolutely going to be able to expose his defense once again for a second time in the last 12 months. So without a doubt in my mind, of course, we are starting Stefon Diggs, but we're really excited about his overall potential and upside this upcoming week based on the matchup and the success he's found. Again, the amount of opportunity he's getting, it's always going to lead to his overall success. Moving on to DeAndre Hopkins is our number 5. Again, DeAndre Hopkins, though he is at the caliber of these other receivers that I've aforementioned, I really do believe that the issue with DeAndre Hopkins mainly resides in the fact that he is not a touchdown upside kind of receiver. Certainly, he's going to get the targets. Again, outside of Stefon Diggs last season, DeAndre Hopkins had the most targets amongst all wide receivers. In fact, in the last 2 seasons of his career, he's led all wide receivers with total targets. So ultimately, I do believe that the targets are going to be there. The opportunity is going to lead to his overall success, and he's going to find said success because he plays against the Tennessee Titans defense. Of course, they gave up the second most points to opposing wide receivers last season, but they've gone ahead and they've retooled their secondary. Of course, they got rid of Malcolm Butler. I don't think they have Adoree Jackson anymore. They brought in guys like Jackrabbit Jenkins and other cornerbacks that are going to try to fill in. They drafted a safety. I don't know if that's going to immediately click because the last time I checked, DeAndre Hopkins has a lot of experience playing against the Tennessee secondary and just that defense and their schemes as a whole. And to be honest, I think he's going to be able to exploit them once again. In 4 out of the last 6 games that DeAndre Hopkins has played against the Tennessee Titans, he has produced 100+ receiving yards. On top of the fact that in a couple of those games, he did, of course, score touchdowns with Watson. Of course, was getting those double-digit touchdown years. I think hopefully we can get back to that. It's just a matter of whether or not Kyler Murray down in the red zone is going to be running the ball or looking for other receivers. Hopefully, DeAndre Hopkins can score a touchdown. But outside of that, the receiving yards, the receptions, those are going to be there and lead to his success this week. Our number 6 wide receiver for today is going to be Justin Jefferson. Again, Justin Jefferson had an incredible rookie season, and hopefully he can continue that momentum going into the 2021 season. He gets to start off with the Cincinnati Bengals, and I've been doing a little bit of research on the Cincinnati Bengals secondary. Of course, they will not have William Jackson anymore. He went over to the Washington football team. That was their best secondary cornerback last season. Of course, they do have Trey Waynes, who did not play last season, but formerly was on the Minnesota Vikings in 2019, had himself a good amount of interceptions, and was a decent cornerback, but nothing at the level in which William Jackson has been producing over the last couple of years for Cincinnati. So when I think about what the potential of Justin Jefferson is, if he is going to continue the momentum in which he found at the late half of the 2020 season and continue that stride into 2021, of course, he should be ranked in this top 6 category, considering the fact that if in fact he is going to be a full-time starter, he's just going to see so much opportunity in this offense. In fact, last season alone, in the 12 games that he played at least or more than 70% of the offensive snaps, he averaged 17.39 fantasy points per game. In the 4 games that Justin Jefferson did not surpass 70% of the offensive snaps for the Minnesota Vikings, mainly had to do with the fact that he was a rookie. Early in the season, wasn't given the full reign of opportunity in this offense, but eventually earned the trust of this offense and is going to continue to be their number 1 overall wide receiver. I believe, though, that the Cincinnati Bengals have a good secondary, they have pretty good cornerbacks and safeties, it's ultimately not going to matter because the opportunity that Justin Jefferson is going to have is obviously going to lead to his success. I think this is going to be a shootout of sorts, and I think Justin Jefferson, of course, playing against his former teammates like Joe Burrow, Jamaar Chase, he's got a lot to show them and kind of welcome them to the full NFL, the way that he's playing it at least. Our number 7 wide receiver for today is going to be DK Metcalf. Of course, DK Metcalf had an incredible breakout season in 2020, mainly because the opportunity was consistently there in comparison to the year prior with Russell Wilson. Of course, they started off on fire, throwing the ball a bunch because, again, they didn't really want to get Chris Carson involved early because he still was coming off of an offseason of a hip injury. So they immediately got to letting Russ cook, and eventually it slowed down. But from weeks 1 through 14 of the 2020 season, DK Metcalf was one of the best, if not the best wide receiver, just consistently scoring points. I mean, I remember there was about 6 straight weeks to begin the 2020 season where the guy was putting up 17 points a week minimum. So again, there's a lot of recency bias with the fact that we remember that there are some bad performances that DK Metcalf produced, but from the first 14 weeks of last season, he was putting up 16.19 fantasy points per game. Now, I know he's had struggles against good secondaries, and the Indianapolis Colts are not shy of having a good secondary. We saw a lot of good production out of Xavier Rhodes, who formerly of the Minnesota Vikings, came over to the Indianapolis Colts and just completely turned around his career. Isaiah Rodgers, Kenny Moore, they are fantastic in the secondary there for the Indianapolis Colts. But regardless of how good they are, I think DK Metcalf is just a completely different machine and is going to prove that this upcoming week. Of course, having himself a great performance. I think, honestly, with the change of the offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron is going to unlock this offense even more than they have been in the past. It is going to let Russell Wilson continue to command this offense and help guys like DK Metcalf and, of course, Tyler Lockett succeed. I expect DK Metcalf, with the consistency he showed last year, continuing that and potentially even being better. Our number 8 wide receiver for this upcoming week is going to be A.J. Brown, a former teammate of DK Metcalf's back at Ole Miss. But A.J. Brown, in my opinion, playing against the Arizona Cardinals, it's going to be a shootout. I think about, okay, the Arizona Cardinals are going to Tennessee. This is probably not going to be a defensive battle. Neither of these teams have really been heavy defensive, teams that are going to just shut down an opposing offense. I think, of course, one side with Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins that we obviously mentioned, they're going to score as many times as they possibly can because they're going to try to have to keep up with what the Tennessee Titans are producing. A lot of people are going to forget the fact that when you play against this Tennessee Titans offense, they are truly a pick your poison kind of offense because it's either you stack the box against Henry or get dropped 150 yards on, or you have to cover one or two of these stud receivers, A.J. Brown, Julio Jones. I think A.J. Brown, of course, in his career thus far, has been an incredible wide receiver option. Unfortunately, hasn't been given the opportunity to excel past what he's just already done. He's averaged about 15 fantasy points per game with Tannehill in the last 24 games that they've played together. He's also scored 17 touchdowns in those 24 regular season games. Anticipating a shootout, I honestly do expect to see something of 80 plus receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, and a handful of receptions for a guy like A.J. Brown, with the potential of even exceeding that. I don't know, maybe he's gotten that much better with the, of course, teachings of Julio Jones this offseason. There's a reason why he is his mentor. Coming into this offense, maybe has elevated the game of A.J. Brown, which I expect to see this season. Number 9 is Keenan Allen. Though Keenan Allen, of course, is playing against a tougher matchup against the Washington football team, I don't really kind of put that against him. Again, a lot of the production you'll see from Keenan Allen is going to be made out of the slot position. And though the Washington football team does have Fuller and William Jackson, a guy that I mentioned earlier with the Cincinnati Bengals last year, though they have good cornerbacks in terms of their outside receivers, that's mainly going to be covering Mike Williams, Guyton, Palmer, guys like that are going to play on the outside. Again, a lot of Keenan Allen's production is going to be in that slot. He's closer to the line of scrimmage. Obviously, he's a security blanket for Justin Herbert. But again, this defense, though it is good, I expect Keenan Allen to get his. He's typically going to get his 12 targets per game, which he averaged with Justin Herbert last year in the games they played together. In fact, in the games they played together, Keenan Allen was averaging 16.12 fantasy points per game and a half PPR last year. I expect them to expand upon that with more production out of this entire offense as a whole, with Eckler back. Bringing in Jared Cook, I think they're obviously going to be able to move the ball, give themselves more opportunities in the red zone, and of course, give a guy like Keenan Allen more opportunities to get more receptions down the line. He is my number 9 this upcoming week. We move on to Terry McLaurin on the other side of this matchup. It's interesting how similar to the conversations we had yesterday in our running back rankings between Alvin Kamara and Aaron Jones being next to each other, we have a similar concept here. Both of these guys are going to be able to feast because I expect it to be a back and forth matchup. I expect Terry McLaurin, F1, to be funnel targeted by Ryan Fitzpatrick because that's what he does. There's a reason why Devontae Parker in 2019 was capable of accomplishing a wide receiver 1 standing in terms of overall fantasy points and a half PPR. It wasn't only because he has the talent, but because he was given the opportunity to produce. And when we talk about what Terry McLaurin has been exposed to in terms of opportunity, Dwayne Haskins, Colt McCoy, Taylor Heineke, Alex Smith, these aren't the greatest quarterbacks. Case Keenum, we definitely haven't seen the full potential of what Terry McLaurin is capable of. And though Ryan Fitzpatrick isn't the greatest quarterback, he's significantly better than the prior options that I've mentioned. And I expect him to take Terry McLaurin from the 1,000-yard wide receiver this year, a guy that has inconsistencies, to being a consistent player every single week as our number 10. We have number 11, Mike Evans. Again, Mike Evans is going to have a field day this week playing against the Dallas Cowboys. Can we ask for anything more in terms of a fantastic matchup for the defending champions? It's going to be tough for the Dallas Cowboys, but luckily, Mike Evans will score a lot, and then the other receiving options on the other side of the coin will certainly be able to have their rebuttal. But ultimately, Mike Evans is going to be able to produce. When I looked at what he was capable of producing last year, besides the double-digit touchdowns, a 7th consecutive season of 1,000 receiving yards, and the consistency he has proven year over year throughout his career. Of course, the question we hear all offseason is whether or not Mike Evans is going to be able to step up with so many mouths to feed in this offense. He was the best he was all season long when Antonio Brown was in that lineup, when Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette were both healthy, when Gronk was there. So, to be honest, I'm not too worried about all these mouths to feed because we know that he's the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. On top of it, the matchup is what truly is going to separate them from all other wide receivers this upcoming week. On Thursday night, they have the privilege of playing against this Dallas secondary that, though they've tried to improve with a new defensive coordinator and new players in the secondary, it's not going to make a difference. The Dallas Cowboys gave up the most receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers last year, a total of 27 in their 17 games. I absolutely do expect Mike Evans to score himself a touchdown and continue to build upon his records year over year. All right, we move on to CeeDee Lamb. Like I was mentioning, when the Tampa Bay Buccaneers come out and score, what is that going to prompt? It's going to prompt the Dallas Cowboys to come out, try to run the ball, realize that they can't, and then pass for the entirety of the game. CeeDee Lamb is an absolute stud. He is going to have a breakout season this year, and I absolutely expect that to begin on Thursday night because, again, when we've seen him play with Dak Prescott, he's been a completely different machine than with the other quarterbacks like Dalton, DiNucci, and Garrett Gilbert. In fact, he was averaging 14.22 fantasy points per game and was the number 12 overall wide receiver in the first 5 games of the 2020 season with Dak Prescott at the quarterback position. Again, like I've mentioned, when a defense like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is so good at stopping the run, it is going to force that offense to pass the ball. I know they don't have Zach Martin. It is going to force a lot of pressure onto Dak, but he's going to have to get the ball out of his hands quickly. He'll look for some of his favorite receivers, CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper. I expect CeeDee Lamb to have himself a good week here. And, of course, get a lot of garbage time touchdowns. Maybe this team comes out and blows out the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We don't know. Of course, it's all speculation at this point. But from what we've seen, I expect this team to be having to come back for a majority of that game and trying to claw their way back into it with CeeDee Lamb, of course, leading the pack. We have our number 13 wide receiver, another player in this matchup. Of course, we have a Tampa Bay sandwich with Evans, CeeDee, and then we're following up with Chris Godwin here as my number 13. Chris Godwin is a fantastic wide receiver. He dealt with a lot of injuries last year, and though those injuries definitely impacted his overall production as a wide receiver in a half PPR standing, he was really good when he was healthy. In the 10 games that he played in full, he was averaging 14.77 fantasy points per game, and we know how much Tom Brady loves to use the slot position. Since 2019, he has been the best slot receiver in the National Football League, of course, with Jameis and then just recently with Brady. They've expanded their continuous rapport and connection with each other this offseason, and I absolutely expect that to expand when you play against the Dallas Cowboys. And I mentioned the fact that they've given up the most touchdowns to opposing wide receivers last season. It really is hard for me to see a possibility in which Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, maybe even Antonio Brown are all succeeding this upcoming week, and that is why Chris Godwin sits at this number 13 spot. A fantastic start, to say the very least. We have Julio Jones. Now, though I don't have a Tennessee Titans jersey for him yet, of course, we have to see more action. We got to get more photos out there of him. I do believe Julio Jones for the Tennessee Titans is going to be a fantastic play this week. Though he is currently hit with the questionable tag, as it currently stands, it is an undesignated reason for why he has the questionable tag. We don't know. The organization is not releasing it, whether it is an injury, a family issue, and some other protocol issue that we are not aware of. As of right now, he's going to be playing and practicing. He practiced on Monday with Ryan Tannehill. They're a full go, and I expect them to definitely have a shootout against this Arizona Cardinals defense. It really is going to be difficult for a defense to not only cover A.J. Brown and Derrick Henry like they very much so struggled to do last season and the last 2 seasons, in fact, but on top of that, adding Julio Jones to this equation is going to make them that much more difficult of an offense to slow down. Last season, Julio Jones played 7 full games for the Atlanta Falcons. He averaged 15.78 fantasy points per game in those contests. I know he has the questionable tag. I know it may concern you, but that's just the nature of the beast of Julio Jones. He's going to have questionable until Sunday, and he's going to ball out. We can go ahead and move on to our number 15 overall prospect. That is Robert Woods. Now, Robert Woods, a.k.a. Bobby Trees in many of our eyes, is a very interesting wide receiver prospect. I want to go ahead and just preface that all season long I'm going to be referring as Robert Woods as sometimes Bobby Trees because that is his alter ego when he doesn't play well in my eyes. So Bobby Trees is the guy that I don't want to mess with. And Bobby Trees is not the guy that I expect to be playing this week. I expect to see Robert Woods. And the reason that's going to be the case is though he has struggled against Chicago in the past, in fact, playing them back in 2019, was out with an injury last year. In 2020, he wasn't able to play against them. But though he's had struggles against them in the past, they no longer have Kyle Fuller. He is gone. He was released. He's now with the Denver Broncos, and that has been one of the better cornerbacks in the National Football League and certainly gave Robert Woods struggles in the past that, of course, made him turn into Bobby Trees. But this upcoming week, we have a brand new offense approaching. We have a quarterback by the name of Matthew Stafford who has a lot of comfort and a lot of experience against a Chicago Bears defense, and especially one that now doesn't have their top flight cornerback there. I expect Robert Woods to produce again. Matthew Stafford against the Bears last season In the 2 games that he played against them, 700 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns. I do expect this offense to produce well, and Robert Woods to lead that in the category of the wide receiver position. Our number 16 for this week is going to be DJ Moore. And though DJ Moore may be a little higher than you would potentially have put him, you can let me know down in the comment section. I honestly think that DJ Moore is going to have himself a great week here and a great season. I think Sam Darnold is going to be a significantly more improved quarterback than a lot of people assume. Playing in New York did not serve him well. They did not surround him with any sort of pieces that could have helped him, and he had Adam Gase leading that offense. So, of course, Sam Darnold struggled. I think with the Carolina Panthers playing against the New York Jets, a little bit of a revenge game, I think he's going to look to DJ Moore as his number 1 wide receiver option based on the matchup itself in terms against their cornerbacks in New York. The Jets do not have great cornerbacks. Their number 1 and 2 corner coverage in terms of their grades overall, according to PFF last year, were not good. They were below par, in fact, and I think DJ Moore is going to be able to exploit that this upcoming week and have himself a fantastic week. I mean, the thing about DJ Moore is he's always had the touchdown elude him, and I expect that to kind of evaporate this year. I don't expect him to be the guy that only catches 4 touchdowns a season. I expect that number to expand, and hopefully that begins here in week 1. Moving on to number 17 is Brandin Aiyuk. Now, the reason why Brandin Aiyuk needs to be mentioned first and foremost is, of course, the fact that, my goodness, this matchup against the Detroit Lions is by far, in my opinion, the best on the week. In comparison to all defenses last year, yes, the Detroit Lions were giving up the 3rd most points to opposing wide receivers, but to end the year last year, they were getting absolutely slaughtered by opposing offenses. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and read the last 4 to 5, 6 games against opposing wide receivers and what those wide receiver cores were able to do against this secondary. Let's not forget, the Detroit Lions, they spent a first-round, number 3 overall pick on a cornerback in 2020, and that didn't really pan out for them because, again, he was a rookie and he was trying to learn. But Justin Jefferson, in the final week of the season, 9 catches, 133. The week prior to that, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, obviously, it was the combination of Godwin, Evans, and Antonio Brown went for 19 receptions, 300 yards, and 4 receiving touchdowns between the 3 of them. The Titans, number 1 and 2 wide receiver, A.J. Brown and Davis combined for 9 catches, 154, 2 touchdowns. The Green Bay duo of Davante Adams and Marquez Valdes-Scantling, 13 catches, 202 receiving touchdowns. Texans, yes, the Texans between Will Fuller and Brandin Cooks, 15 catches, 197 and a touchdown. My gosh, they gave up a lot of points. So why not the duo for the San Francisco 49ers? Jimmy G's healthy. They're ready to throw. And I expect Brandin Aiyuk to pick up where he left off. Let's not forget the last 7 games of his season. The man was averaging 15.15 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. Brandin Aiyuk's a stud. This matchup is beautiful. Moving on to Tyler Lockett as our number 18 overall prospect. I like Tyler Lockett this week. I know a lot of people look at Tyler Lockett and immediately correlate him with inconsistency, but with that being said, I expect this offense to be transformed. I expect Tyler Lockett to see even more targets this upcoming season, though his numbers have increased by a ridiculous amount year over year since 2018. And of course, his touchdowns have stayed consistent with 10, 8, and 10 in the last 3 seasons. As of this current moment in time, playing against the Indianapolis Colts, I did mention it. They have a good secondary, but that's not going to stop Tyler Lockett from turning into Tyler Lockett 2.0, because with Shane Waldron there, he is going to see even more opportunity, giving him opportunity similar to what Cooper Kupp saw in Los Angeles. When you want to find the most successful Tyler Lockett you possibly can, you have to find that way, giving him opportunity, specifically 8+ targets. Last season alone, in the games in which he had 8+ targets, he was averaging about 13 fantasy points per game. If you don't even include the 3 games in which he had over 27 fantasy points. Otherwise, in the games in which he had 8 or more total targets, he was averaging 21.3 fantasy points per game last year. Targets are going to lead to success. Opportunity is the number 1 metric in fantasy football. I expect Tyler Lockett to get that this week and produce certainly. We have number 19, Amari Cooper. Again, this matchup is going to be very advantageous for the Dallas Cowboys because they're going to throw the entire time. And if Dak Prescott is truly healthy and he is ready to go, we have seen Amari Cooper, of course, he's been coming back and battling from injury. I expect him to pick up exactly where he left off with Dak. And where did he leave off? Being the number 1 overall receiving option in this offense. And though the biggest difference maker between Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb may be the option of that touchdown, Amari Cooper gets a boatload of targets, receptions that lead to fantasy points. In the first 4 weeks of the 2020 season with Dak, he had 37 receptions on 51 targets, 401 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown, which was 16.65 fantasy points per game and was a number 3 overall wide receiver. Ultimately, I expect this offense to throw the entire time, and though that kind of production in a full PPR gets Amari Cooper in the top 12, 13 conversation. In a half PPR, it unfortunately kind of dwindles down his overall productivity and doesn't really have him as that great of an option. Just putting in perspective, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they have been prone to number one receiving options that are studs. Specifically, Ridley, Hill, Woods, Cooper Kupp. All four of those guys in the middle of the season in that stretch went for over 130 yards a pop against them. So we know that wide receivers can do it against the secondary. It's just a matter if they get the opportunity. Adam Thielen's our number 20 overall wide receiver this week because, again, though he is a fantastic wide receiver option, and I expect him to benefit a lot from the fact that Justin Jefferson does take the number one coverage away, and the running game of Dalvin Cook is certainly going to be something that defenses have to pay attention to, especially the Cincinnati Bengals, who haven't been able to stop the run for year over year. Adam Thielen's going to be a sneaky play. Without Irv Smith there, he is going to continue to see more and more targets in comparison to what I anticipated earlier off this in the offseason. But going into this upcoming week, truly, it's a matter of whether or not he scores a touchdown. Because last season, yes, we know he scored 14 total touchdowns, but he had 7 games in which he had less than 50 receiving yards. Those contests are not going to give us the Adam Thielen we want. We don't want a guy that's going to catch the ball 6 times for 50 yards in a half PPR. We don't need 8 points. In 3 of those 7 contests that he had less than 50 receiving yards, he was saved by a receiving touchdown. So we have to just kind of put it out there. There's a potential in which Adam Thielen doesn't get the yardage. And if he doesn't get that touchdown, he will leave us out to dry. We just have to wait and see. Of course, his numbers in terms of red zone opportunity went down significantly with, of course, the explosion of Justin Jefferson from weeks 13 through 17 of last season. But hopefully Adam Thielen can at least start off hot and come out as a stud wide receiver in the top 20 range. Number 21 is Cooper Kupp for us. In my opinion, the arguments are very similar in conjunction with what I talked about with Robert Woods. Cooper Kupp is going to be a huge part of this offense. It's just a matter of whether or not he's going to be given the opportunity. In the last 2 games against the Chicago Bears, he has not played well. 1 in 2020, 1 in 2019. He totaled for 9 targets, 9 receptions, 96 total yards. But the question is, that was with Jared Goff. And if you're going to get a quarterback that is significantly better, who has the experience against the Chicago Bears defense, who has seen it year over year for his entire career over the past decade, and has recently, just in 2020, produced about 350 passing yards and 2 passing touchdown average against that defense, why not go ahead and anticipate probably this offense scoring a lot and putting up a lot of points through their 2 receiving options, Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. That is why I have Cooper Kupp here at number 21. I don't expect him to have the big play upside like a Robert Woods does sitting at the outside receiver position, but I do expect Cooper Kupp to get a lot of involvement, whether that is on a handoff, whether it is on the goal line scoring a rushing touchdown. He has those aspects to give him extra total opportunity in comparison to the other wide receivers in this offense. That gives him extra value. Moving on to our number 22, we have Diontae Johnson. He has played against the Bills recently, and in fact, that was last season at the end of the year. Was a primetime television game, and a lot of people remember the fact that he dropped a couple key passes. Then the narrative began. Diontae Johnson's butterfingers, this and that, and I understand it. I get it. But let's be real. Diontae Johnson is a stud wide receiver because of the opportunity he's given. He may not be the most talented in the league. He may not have the best route running. He may not be the biggest guy that has the highest vertical, the fastest. He's not all of those things. But the opportunity and the trust of Ben Roethlisberger is what gives him value, and that is going to continue to exceed year over year as we continue to see them build more of a rapport. Again, he had 150 targets last year, and there was multiple games in which he left with an injury. I mean, when we talk about the fact that in the 12 full games that he played during the regular season, in 10 of them, he had double-digit targets. That is, of course, going to lead to success. I know that there's the question of whether or not Tre'Davious White is going to be covering him. I think Tre'Davious White is going to be looking in the direction of Claypool as they'll leave Diontae Johnson to torch whatever other secondary member they have there in Buffalo. I expect Diontae Johnson to have himself a good week 1 here as my number 22. Number 23 is T. Higgins. T. Higgins plays against the Minnesota Vikings. They gave up, if I'm not mistaken, the 5th most points to opposing wide receivers last year, mainly because that secondary had injuries, had people leave like Trey Waynes. Of course, we had rookies, a lot of inexperience there in a culmination of this defense not being able to stop anyone anywhere. Of course, it led to the wide receivers exposing that defense on a weekly basis. And the question is, what are we going to anticipate this week? Are we going to see a similar Minnesota secondary? They have Harrison Smith. They do have a couple players in the secondary, but are they good enough to stop a T. Higgins-esque player, a guy that from weeks 2 through 10 of the 2020 season with Joe Burrow was averaging about 13 fantasy points per game? I know the Minnesota Vikings acquired some cornerback talent, specifically Breeland and Patrick Peterson, to kind of bolster their secondary in order to kind of give it a little bit of juice considering how bad they were last offseason. Patrick Peterson did not play well last year. Maybe he shows up in this defense and completely changes everything around. Breeland is a good cornerback, but to be honest, I really do think that regardless of who's covering, T. Higgins is going to be given opportunity. And if and when he does, this offense, both teams are going to be scoring back and forth. I expect Joe Burrow to potentially throw the ball, 40, 50 times in week 1 in order to keep up with the opposing offense. And if and when they do, of course, T. Higgins is going to be able to produce. I expect him regardless of what he's facing against. Though Breeland has played well, even if he is covering him, maybe it's Patrick Peterson and they do us a favor, I expect T. Higgins to produce. The last wide receiver for our top 24 is Allen Robinson. And though he plays against Jalen Ramsey in that stud secondary of the Los Angeles Rams, I still think that Allen Robinson is a stud and he should be played because he can very easily produce as long as the quarterback play is there. In the last 2 games that he's played against the Los Angeles Rams defense, he's had 4 receptions on 4 targets for 70 receiving yards. And in the game prior, 4 receptions on 6 targets, only 15 receiving yards. There are multiple times when I go and I put on the film against the Los Angeles Rams that very blatantly, Allen Robinson is just winning in the one-on-one matchup against Jalen Ramsey, just blatantly. But unfortunately, the quarterback play was not there, wasn't up to par. Mitch Trubisky was overthrowing passes and just not giving him the ability to succeed. I think Andy Dalton's probably going to be in the same scenario. I do believe Allen Robinson can still persevere through the ineptitude of the quarterback, and maybe they're going to switch to Justin Fields and it'll change everything. But as of right now, I think the matchup is tough, and I certainly do believe that he is a guy that I'm still going to play. But we got to be careful about it. As we move on to our wide receiver 3 category, we begin with an upside wide receiver 3 by the name of Robby Anderson here at number 25. Robby Anderson was great last season, had the best career season, had the most receptions on the Carolina Panthers, and honestly produced very well for many of us in fantasy, especially in a full PPR. But in a half PPR, unfortunately, his value is a little bit reduced because he does rely upon the receptions rather than the potential of upside touchdowns, which it really hasn't been presented for him in Carolina. But hopefully this upcoming week, based on the matchup, there's a possibility in which Robby Anderson can expand upon his greatest season in 2020 and have himself a fantastic 2021 year. Him and Donald going against the Jets, a revenge game to say the very least. I expect both of them to produce well and potentially getting Robby Anderson into the wide receiver 2 category. But for right now, we leave him in the upper echelon of the wide receiver 3s. We have number 26, Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay should be healthy. I watched some film of him last week at practice, making cuts. The hamstring injury, though he is still hit with the questionable tag, is not going to bother him. He should be playing. But the issue with Kenny Golladay is mainly the matchup is going to be tough. I mean, again, you're playing against the Denver Broncos. They have got fantastic cornerbacks. Again, they brought in Kyle Fuller. They, spent their first-round pick on Patrick Surtain. You're just continuing to build a secondary that just has monsters across the board. So yeah, the no-fly zone might be a thing this year, but that being said, Kenny Golladay is a wide receiver that very much so has a little bit of experience against Kyle Fuller. Again, they used to play in the same division, and in the games that Kenny Golladay has gone against Kyle Fuller just recently, 6 catches, 78 yards and a touchdown, 5 catches, 90 yards, 3 catches, 57 and a touchdown, 4 catches, 158 and a touchdown. He's produced very well against that Chicago defense, specifically against Kyle Fuller, and I think he'll be able to do that this upcoming week against Denver. But obviously, the level at which he does it is going to be up to the quarterback play. Daniel Jones is the biggest question mark, and though Kenny Golladay in the last 4 starts of his career in 2020 was averaging 13.95 fantasy points per game, again, it's all about whether or not he's going to be able to get enough targets from Daniel Jones to produce. Moving on to number 27, Odell Beckham Jr. A lot of the stuff that I'm hearing is that the Odell Beckham Jr. that is currently with the Cleveland Browns, that was practicing with them all offseason, is the best Odell Beckham Jr. that the organization has seen since he got to Cleveland. Overall, of course, has learned a lot from the injury and having to fight back from it last year, of course, the ACL injury that he sustained against the Dallas Cowboys. And to be honest, in that Dallas Cowboys game, a couple weeks prior, he had finally found his stride in terms of this offense. I expect Odell Beckham to be used similar to how Stefon Diggs was used when Kevin Stefanski, the offensive coordinator of the former Minnesota Vikings, now the head coach of the Cleveland Browns, kind of used him. So I expect him to be a 1,000-yard wide receiver, deep ball touchdowns, being able to get a couple of receptions here and there, but not being a guy that's going to get over 130 total, overall targets. The opportunity is not going to be at that level because this is a run-first offense with a lot of mouths to feed in their own respect. Because again, they do have the option of Landry or Peoples-Jones or Austin Hooper, David Njoku. They've got a lot of guys that they can get the ball to. But either way, I expect Odell Beckham Jr. to start off this upcoming week against Kansas City Chiefs with some points, because again, they're going to have to catch up in order to keep up with that Chiefs offense. We have Corey Davis as our number 28. He's the number one wide receiver for the Jets. Zach Wilson is going to look for him every single play, in my opinion. I know that there's some talks that Crowder could come back this upcoming week, but outside of Jamison Crowder, Corey Davis has the most experience in terms of the entire NFL. You have Denzel Mims, Elijah Moore. You got a backfield of very young players, except for Tevin Coleman. They need someone to help lead this offense. Tyler Kroft is their best tight end. Again, this offense isn't the greatest, and luckily for them, they play against Carolina. I do believe there's a very good and strong chance that Corey Davis comes out, balls out like he's going to do all season long, because he's going to be funnel targeted by Zach Wilson. We have Brandin Cooks as number 29. Brandin Cooks, though he has Tyrod Taylor, he is a great wide receiver. He has produced a lot of 1,000-yard years, and he has had himself a lot of success against the Jacksonville Jaguars just as of late. Last year, when he was with the Houston Texans with Deshaun Watson at the quarterback position, I know that is the caveat, but with Deshaun Watson, he had 2 games against the Texans. First one, 8 catches, 161 yards and a touchdown. Second one, 3 catches, 83 yards and a touchdown. Tyrod Taylor makes a big difference. Tyler Taylor, in the one lone start he had in 2020, didn't throw a touchdown. That concerns me, but hopefully the Jacksonville defense isn't good enough to stop them and hopefully give some value to Brandin Cooks. Deebo Samuel are number 30. I mentioned it with Aiyuk. This Detroit Lions defense cannot stop a soul. That is just a given in my anticipation or my expectation. I expect to see Deebo Samuel and Aiyuk produce well. I'll go ahead and mention it once again if you didn't listen to the part with Brandon Aiyuk involved. The Detroit Lions in the last 6 games of the 2020 season were giving up a boatload of points. In fact, to the wide receiver cores of specifically Carolina, Houston, Green Bay, Tennessee, and Buccaneers, with 2 wide receivers. The combination of Moore and Robinson went for 15 catches, 197 and 1. The combination of Fuller and Brandin Cooks went for 256 and 2. Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Adams went for 13, 200 and 2. Of course, A.J. Brown and Corey Davis went for 9 catches, 154 and 2. A.B., Mike Evans, and Godwin went for 19 catches, 304. And then Justin Jefferson by himself, 9 catches, 133. Detroit cannot stop a soul. They won't be able to stop even Deebo Samuel. Even if Deebo Samuel doesn't have a wide range of dot or opportunity, he's still going to be able to be a good option because that defense is just going to get poured on. All right, we have JuJu Smith-Schuster as our 31. JuJu, in my opinion, a lot of people look at him and think, yeah, he's the TikTok guy, this and that. They don't look at him as a fantasy prospect anymore, and he's being undervalued quite consistently, which is unfortunate considering how much talent he has and how much he's proven in the last, couple of years here. Just last season, at the back end of the season, he was consistently a huge part of that offense. Yes, he has an occasional inconsistent game because of how many receiving options there are on this offense, but when I think of this offense and who's going to be on the field more often, the Pittsburgh Steelers, yes, they like to run a lot of 3 wide receiver sets, but when they break it down to 2, it'll be JuJu and Diontae. I expect JuJu Smith-Schuster to kind of build on what he did last year against Buffalo. Had himself 6 catches, 55 yards, and a touchdown. He is a huge part of this offense, had the most red zone targets amongst all receiving options on that team last year, and is one of the main core targets of Ben Roethlisberger, and I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. JuJu Smith's my number 31. 32 is Antonio Brown, though I do believe Antonio Brown and this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense has one of the easiest matchups, considering, again, the Dallas Cowboys gave up the most receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers last season. The question is whether AB is going to be given enough opportunity, and if this team is going to get ahead so early, they're just running the ball the entire second half. If that's the case, then maybe AB can get an occasional quick touchdown here and there against this terrible Dallas Cowboys secondary. But ultimately, I know I've talked about it this offseason. AB has been a stud when he's joined this offense. In the 8 games that he played, he was a consistent member, putting up over 12 fantasy points per game. That's all you want. And if you can get that out of a wide receiver 3 on an average basis, with the potential for upside, especially in good matchups, we'll take it. AB, the last thing that I heard earlier this morning was that Bruce Arians, specifically their head coach, was talking about Antonio Brown looks like the Antonio Brown of old, the guy from 4 or 5 years ago with the Pittsburgh Steelers. If that's how he really looks, then maybe we should be ranking him a little bit higher. Number 33 is Courtland Sutton, and specifically number 34 is Jerry Jeudy. I wanted to flank both these guys because this is very similar to the Denver Broncos running backs from yesterday. I don't know where these guys are going to be by the end of the week. I know James Bradbury is a great cornerback for the New York Giants, and I know he's going to definitely put a lot of pressure on these receiving options, but I think there's a reason why Teddy Bridgewater was able to at least funnel 3 wide receivers, specifically DJ Moore, Robby Anderson, and Curtis Samuel, and make them all top 25 wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format. I expect one of these guys to have a breakout game. Which of the two? That's just a matter of who James Bradbury is going after. The opposite one is going to be scoring. I think both of them have potential great upside this week because, again, it should be a back and forth scoring matchup. But either way, I think it's just a matter of what we're going to potentially see and who's going to be the target leader out of this, overall offense. We have Jamaar Chase as our number 35. I think Jamaar Chase, of course, he's got to get out of his own head. He's dropping too many passes in the preseason, but he luckily has a decent matchup, in my opinion. He will have potentially either Breeland or Patrick Peterson. He's going to have a quick welcome to the National Football League. It's either going to be adapt or get crushed. And that's why I have him at this point, because I'm not sure if he's going to immediately be able to function at the level in which a number 5 overall pick in an NFL draft is going to be expected to do so, especially the wide receiver position. So hopefully Jamaar Chase picks up and at least begins the season strong, as, of course, we expect Joe Burrow to be sending him the ball very often. The last option, and my number 36 to close out my top 36 wide receiver rankings for this week, is Laviska Shenault. We've talked about Shenault a lot this offseason. He has the 7th easiest matchup against the Houston Texans. The last time we played against them, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 79 receiving yards. When he's healthy, when he is an active part of this offense, which we expect to see because Trevor Lawrence in his final year at Clemson, of course, funnel targeted Amari Rodgers, his slot receiver. They, combined for a lot of statistics and led the nation in a lot of slot receiving statistics because he's going to send the ball in that direction. I expect the Laviska Shenault to be a huge part of this offense and my number 36 on the week. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you haven't yet already, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be making this kind of content all season long. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about the quarterback position, my top 16 rankings, giving you guys some perspective. Be sure to smash that like button. Of course, leave a comment down below. Let me know who I'm missing and what rankings you guys potentially see either too high or too low going into week 1 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.